Well, as you can usually tell with this, I'm recording today for this homily 7.2 of my 9-part series on the Eucharist. And as I mentioned, I covered it yesterday, but in this sweep of 9 months, we covered transubstantiation. We're kind of in the middle of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And it's a little dense. I'm trying to figure out a way to pare this down and make it a little more palatable for a homily. So I'll go a little off the script to just kind of describe it. But what we know is that Calvary, once and for all, and Christ's sacrifice on Calvary was sufficient. He doesn't need to be crucified again. It is the one saving sacrifice of Calvary. At the same time, the Eucharist is not merely symbolic, but it is a real and true sacrifice. So we have this tension, but it's a relative sacrifice, meaning it's relative to the absolute sacrifice of Calvary. And so the Eucharist brings forth Calvary in a certain way. And the debate is, how does it do that, right? Because Christ is now glorified in heaven. He comes to us, and there's a sacrifice in the altar based on his real presence, but he is glorified in heaven. He doesn't suffer anymore. So somebody might ask from outside the Catholic faith, how do you manage all of this, right? I don't get it, right? Would be the question. So that's kind of the problem. Now the answer, Thomas approaches this with sacramental theology. And he says all that Christ did and suffered in his life is available to us through the sacraments, through spiritual contact, not physical contact, right? It's not physical because he died 2,000 years ago. His death doesn't have like literal physical impact on you, right? But it has spiritual contact. But everything he did, the temptations in the desert, are available to you through the sacraments. His speaking of the parables are available to you through the sacraments, right? Thomas gets to this idea most when he has a question on whether the resurrection is itself the cause of the resurrection of our bodies. Now we might all say, oh, sure it is, but you have to think about it for a second. Is it the glorified Christ in heaven that would resurrect our bodies? Or does this event 2,000 years ago cause our resurrections? Individually, yours, mine, right? And the answer is, it is that event that causes your resurrection. The only reason you can be resurrected is because something happened 2,000 years ago. That event has efficient causality. The way I move the mic with my hand, the resurrection causes your resurrection. Right? So that's kind of his reply in a certain article in the Summa. On the sacrifice of the Mass, St. Thomas Aquinas didn't have a lot to say, and you might wonder why. He has one article on it, but it's because it was pre-Tridentine, right? 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas was before the Protestant Reformation, when the issue of the sacrifice of the Mass by Protestant reformers was brought to the fore. So therefore, Thomas didn't have a big debate swirling about him in which he would have answered with probably many articles and many questions. Rather, it was just understood and assumed. So he has kind of one article on it, and he addresses it. And basically what it is the way the sacrament of the Eucharist brings forth the sacrifice of Calvary is through two things: image and effect. Representation, application. The beauty of Thomas is he doesn't overstep his theology. He's very humble, and he keeps the answer within sacramental theology. Just by sacramental theology, he's able to get to the sacrifice of the Eucharist as bringing forth the sacrifice of Calvary to us. So the double consecration on the altar. We tend to think the bread and wine are the symbols, but they're kind of only the first symbols. They're just merely the symbols to show us that we're going to be nourished. Just as we're nourished physically, we're nourished spiritually. But when the bread is consecrated into the precious body and the wine is consecrated into the precious blood, you have a separation of precious body from precious blood. So what you're getting is a transubstantiated image. By divine power, he sends down an image of the separation of Christ's body and blood to represent the sacrifice of Calvary. It's such a perfect image because it's Christ's own body and blood that's an image that's so perfect it brings forth, you could say, brings forth Calvary. It's a perfect image, right? And it's not simply divine omnipotence, right? God could move you in actual grace today to go do something you normally wouldn't do. It's divine omnipotence. This is different. This is divine symbolism. Every time we do it, it's guaranteed that's the effect, right? There's a distinction between the discretion of divine omnipotence and the way God puts himself here by the action of a sacrament. So there is order of creation, right? The created order. There is the order of glory in heaven. There is the order of grace. But tied up in it is this created reality of sacraments where it's by divine image rather than divine omnipotence that the effect occurs. That's the double consecration. It's extremely important for the sacrifice of the Mass. The second is the effect. It's called a sacrifice in respect of the effect of the Passion, because by this sacrament we are made partakers of the fruit or the graces of our Lord's Passion. We commune twice at the Mass. We commune in the sacrifice. Then we commune in the Eucharist. We eat the body and blood of Christ. The first communion is we're communing in the sacrifice that goes on. So what I mentioned is sometimes you see this in the Hispanic culture where for a certain reverence for the Eucharist and maybe their own sense of their sinfulness or respect for the Eucharist, people don't receive Holy Communion as regularly as in the Anglo community. You might go, why don't they receive? It's a certain piety and it's a certain thing. They're still communing in the sacrifice of the Mass when they attend, right? The intention today is for Msgr Burke. That intention is not associated with us consuming the Eucharist. It's associated with the sacrifice of the Mass, because that we can give to others. Our own communion of the Eucharist is only for ourselves. So what can you do in the sacrifice of the Mass, right? So apart from receiving Holy Communion, when you come, what can you do? Number one, you can commune in the charity of Christ crucified. Later, around the altar, is God the Son offering himself in perfect image of Calvary to the Father. You're here as a very privileged participant. You are here in the full charity of Calvary, right? Second, you can then offer up Christ's passion to the Father with him, so you can offer those merits for yourself or others. For example, I offer it today for Msgr Burke. Number three, you can unite your own sufferings and merits under grace to the life of Christ crucified offered to the Father. You can conform your joys and sorrows in charity to the mystery of Christ crucified. So let's say I come to Mass as the priest. What can I offer the Lord? The utter juggernaut of emails and meetings as a chancery staffer. I got something to offer. The sheer joy of always being in meetings and emails. I'm sure you got something that you can offer. Maybe the workday isn't just so glorious and so perfect. You can offer it. You can join it, and it's joined to the perfect sacrifice of Christ. As we celebrate the Eucharist today, we ask our Lord to give us and others a greater appreciation of the sacrifice of the Mass.